Welcome in, everyone. You're listening to Bulls Central. The NBA season just around the corner, kicking off this week. The Bulls open their season on Wednesday against the Pelicans, and I thought, what better time than to bring our guy, our friend, Will the Goat Gottlieb back onto the channel to talk things all Bulls and expectations going into the season. So it's my pleasure. Welcome back to the show, Will Gottlieb of CHGO. Will, it's good to see you again, man. Appreciate you making the time.
Yeah, always fun to come on with you, and I'm just glad we can do it. I mean, I know you're dealing with some technical difficulties, some security issues here, so I'm glad we're back on the channel and can make this happen.
Yeah, and I'll address that to my audience as far as like what happened and best practices because I'm sure other folks are probably gonna run into those same kinds of things eventually. There's a lot of content creators out there that just kind of need to be careful with the situation, but I'll save that for another time. Now, Will, let's talk about this upcoming season, expectations for some of the players as well as the team as a whole. But I wanted to start with the Bulls preseason play. I don't know about you, but the main thing that I'm looking at and focusing on the preseason is not obviously the win loss column, but more so how the guys are looking out there, their style of play, how they're working together, the offensive schemes, how individual players are looking, especially the newcomers and how they fit with this crew. There were a number of things that stood out to me from the Bulls preseason play, but I actually wanted to get your thoughts on some of the biggest things that stood out to you and what you took away from the preseason.
Yeah, number one, I would just say is like the pace that they're playing. I mean, you look at what they were last few years with DeRozan, like not a knock on DeMar at all. I mean, we all know
Right.
how talented he is, and how special he is at his craft. But when you are built around a guy like that, you play his style of basketball, and
For
that's
sure.
a little bit slower, a little bit more methodical, a little bit more half court oriented. And I think without him, one, I think they wanted to add some more pace and three-point shooting over the past couple of years and just weren't able to do it for whatever reason. But then you remove him from the equation, you introduce Josh Giddey, whose skills are to play fast, to get downhill, to try to spray it out to shooters. And I think, they actually have the personnel to change their style of play. And we saw that bear out in preseason, right? They were towards the top of the league in pace. They were number 2 in the league in 3-point attempts. And so I just think stylistically, this is going to be a lot different than the last couple of years. I think it'll be a little bit more exciting to play a more transition oriented game, and just to like kind of enter the modern era, right? I mean, this team
Yeah.
was so far behind the mark in all these like key indicators that define success for a lot of teams. And they just weren't able to keep pace. And so, I think there's going to be a little bit more of a talent gap between the Bulls and most other teams now, given that they don't have DeRozan and Caruso, but they should, or at least they're hoping to make up for some of that with more three-point volume, more easy baskets throughout the course of a game in transition, and we'll see how it works out. But so far through preseason, I think they've really, um, I've had to readjust my expectations of what the ceiling can be offensively with this group because I think they have already started to click a lot easier. And the guys in the locker room would agree. I mean, they're saying, look, this feels really natural. This is what we have to be doing, and everybody's buying in. So all positive signs through preseason. Preseason caveat, of course, but all positive signs.
I was just going to ask, do you think that this type of play can translate into the regular season? Obviously, you got to add the preseason qualifier. They're going up against, different lineups that probably aren't, their starters and things like that. Do you see it still working going into the preseason, knowing that obviously it's going to be a different sense of, competitive play?
So I think that there's kind of two parts to that. One is, can they sustain this style of play? And then the second part being like, can the production sustain? And I think those are
Right.
kind of two separate things. I think stylistically, like I said, just because of the personnel, they're gonna kind of have to play this way. I think they
Right.
can lean more into that. And with the way that, guys like Josh Giddey and even Coby and Zach, like they want to run, they want to get out in transition, they want easier baskets. Lonzo being back, I think helps a lot in that regard too. So I think in terms of like the style and the way that they want to play, this is kind of what you're hoping to see. And I think it will translate, maybe not quite to the same extent. But I think the real question is like the results. I mean, they
Yeah.
shot super well in those last 4 preseason games from beyond the arc. They shot 20 of 40 something in their first game. So there's gonna be nights where the ball is not going in from three. And what happens on those nights? I mean, the defense I think is going to be a bit of an issue. And if you're taking the ball out from underneath the basket, it's hard to get up and run in transition. So
Yeah.
I think that will be the biggest challenge. But stylistically, I think it should sustain. It's just a matter of like, do the shots go in, and are they easy? Are they able to, offset that on nights where they just aren't shooting the ball super well?
So we've also obviously got to talk about Lonzo Ball. Only played the two final games of the preseason, but I think for any fan, even the most optimistic fan, couldn't have expected Lonzo to show up as well as he did. Now, like I said, I know it's preseason. He only played 16 minutes in each game, so you have to add that qualifier. But coming out after not playing for 2.5 years and almost looking like he picked up where he left off. Obviously, he wasn't the same in terms of his general quickness, maybe some athleticism, but the shooting was still there, the defensive intensity still there, the passing, just the general IQ and ability to impact the game, even in his limited minutes, was there. Still, all these years later, and look, I don't know if I should be reading into it too much because it's the preseason, but his presence on the court and how he impacts the energy level of the other guys in my view, was palpable. And it was almost like the Bulls got their swagger, their identity back that we saw from the start of that 2021 season. Can we expect this also to translate into the regular season? And actually, I guess kind of a two-part question, since I know, you've been watching the guys in practices. You're actually heading to practice shortly after this. How has Lonzo been responding in practices, and is that knee still doing well going into the games this week?
Yeah, so I think I'll hit on the last part first, which is, is he healthy? And I think he is. Like Billy has said this a couple times, like nothing he's done out there is different from what they've been seeing in practice. Obviously there's going to be like some soreness and fatigue with the knee just coming back from this play, but I don't want to like sound the alarm bells because it's not like it's
Sure.
re-aggravated or re-injured or anything like
Right.
that. That's not the case. But clearly being away from the game for that long, it's going to take some time for his body to readjust to that. And, he's been the first to say it's a brand new knee. And so
Sure.
I think there's going to be a long period of time, maybe the rest of his career, where you're just monitoring it. You're maintaining, you're doing tests, you're making sure that, you're not overloading the leg with too much um, anything to where you put the rest of his career in jeopardy. And I think that long-term approach has been very much the focus for both Lonzo and the team, which is great. That's how they should be handling this. But in terms of him and just like the way he's playing, it really is crazy. And this is the first time I've seen him. CHGO started in March 2022. So
Right.
about a
Right.
month and a half after his original injury on January 14th, 2022. So this is the first time I've gotten a chance to cover him. And he's just so like even keeled. He's so optimistic. He's always talking about like, how, yeah, of course, there were times where this like rehab was difficult and like finding out that he had to do the cartilage transplant. It was going to be another 18 months after being out for 18 months already. Like that's daunting, but he's just
Yeah.
continued to persevere. And like you said, his IQ is a superpower of his. I mean, he really is like a basketball savant. He knows where to be. He knows how to position himself to make plays on both sides of the ball. You feel the way that he gets the ball up ahead and creates easier shots for guys. So I think that's another element too, is like now you introduce him to the second unit and you're not really falling off at all in terms of style of play or talent even. And we'll see how they, continue to add minutes throughout the course of the year. Obviously he's not going to play back to backs, but right
Right.
now 15-minute, 16-minute limit. I think they're going to try to expand that as the course of the season goes on. And he just adds so much to this team on both sides. He really is a special player. It's incredible to see him. I mean, obviously he's not quite the same, but like to not really miss a step in terms of who he is as a player, I think is as much of a miracle as just getting back on the court.
So a bit of a controversial topic then. And apologies if you guys have actually already addressed this on CHGO. I haven't been able to catch the last few episodes. But with Lonzo, the way he's been playing, as well as the way Io has looked, I know he missed a couple preseason games as well. But both those guys and their ability to impact winning on both ends of the floor, there's this discourse that's starting to build around the fan base of, hey, does it make sense to start Josh Giddey? And look, I think both you and I know, knowing this front office, knowing the politics behind this, Giddey is going to start, unless he's injured. There's no world where he's going to be coming off the bench in favor of Io or even Lonzo, especially with his minutes restrictions. But I'm curious, do you think it's a valid point based on what you've seen in the preseason and more importantly, the Bulls' need for adding defense in the starting unit?
Absolutely. I mean, look, I think there's a segment of fans who are like very excited about a young player who is like creative passer who can do like exciting fun stuff on the court. And then there's a segment of fans who are a little bit concerned about his limitations and what that means for his ability to fit into not just the Bulls roster but any roster long term. And then, coming into, today I believe is the final day for him to sign a contract extension. Like what does that mean and how much money does he get on his next deal? All that stuff matters. And you're already seeing I don't want to say guys outplay him. He's had, a bad shooting night in his most recent game. I think that, recency bias is going to stand out to people.
Right.
Um, he's clearly a talented player, and I think he can help the Bulls play the style of play that they want to. But he's also got these really important limitations that prevent him from being on the court in meaningful minutes in the playoffs, as he was last year. I mean, the OKC Thunder had to bench him in the second half, and then eventually just in games to be able to compete with the Dallas Mavericks in that series. So
Right.
I think there's a case for it. To your point, I don't think they're going to, just because the Bulls want to give him every chance to establish himself and, prove himself as a guy that obviously he wants to get paid, and
Sure.
justifiably so. But the Bulls need to figure out, like, is this a guy worth paying? And so the more he's on the court, the more they can evaluate that. And so I think that's going to be one of the more important elements of this season, assuming a deal doesn't get done by the end of the day.
So I was going to ask about that. I did want to touch on his contract extension as the deadline, like you said, is today. Do you think that they will reach an agreement by the end of the day today? What's the latest you're hearing going into the deadline? How likely do you think it is that both sides reach an agreement?
Yeah, I'm sure they're talking, and I'm sure they are well, I don't want to say I'm sure. I would have a hard time seeing them getting a deal done. Look, you trade a really important piece for a guy in Alex Caruso, who's obviously your most valuable trade asset at the time of the deal, right?
Right.
It's he's in his third year. He's finished up his third year. He's entering his fourth season. That's when guys sign contract extensions. We just saw Moses
Right.
Moody with the Warriors out by you sign a 3 year, $39 million deal. And so you make a trade like that and you kind of understand that there is going to be a deal eventually. But I think the Bulls would be wise to not do anything, unless you can get like a really incredible, like below market team friendly deal. I just don't think it really makes sense, because you have this opportunity to evaluate him with the guys that are part of your future. Patrick, Coby, Io, Jalen Smith, even, who they just brought in for a couple of years. Like, you want to see what he looks like with all those guys before you commit any amount of money to him, because
Okay, will
if
the
he
league?
doesn't look good,
Sorry,
if he doesn't look good, uh,
I don't know if it was on my.
then
Go ahead.
yeah, if he doesn't look good, then you have to decide, like, is he worth keeping around? And so any commitment long term at this point, I think, would be the risk is more on the team than it is on the player, right? And so unless you're getting, like I said, a really team friendly deal, it probably just makes more sense to let him get to restricted free agency and let the market determine his value. If another team wants to come in with a massive offer sheet that you can't match, then you're going to have to be okay with losing him. But at this point, it's just like, probably for what you're trying to do longer term, in terms of getting in back into the top 10 these next 2 years, top 8 next year, keeping those draft picks and then building around that core of players. Like, you don't want to jeopardize any of that team building down the line. And so I think that's the risk associated with it. And that's why it's like a little bit dangerous. And I think some people do want to get him to resign, but it's also why they need to be incredibly careful with this, and why it was a risky move in the first place. Nothing against
Yeah,
Josh, like, he's been great, but I think just from the team's perspective, they need to, like, kind of play this a little bit more conservatively.
yeah, and I mean, historically speaking, this is what the Bulls have done, right? They did it with Patrick, they did it with Kobe, even further back with Lauri Markkanen, right, in the sign and trade deal. They've opted to wait and let the market dictate, players' value. Even with, I mean, this was previous regime, right? Even Jimmy Butler, I believe, same approach. Just to kind of stay on topic with Giddey, I did want to talk about your exclusive one-on-one interview with him, which for those that missed it, go check out the article we'll put out on his exclusive sit down with Josh. I'll leave a link to that in the description. But in that discussion that you had with him, you obviously talked about a number of things, but I actually want to sort of focus on his mentality going into this season. Some of the off-court distractions and what people have been saying about him on social media. The off-court stuff, in my view, probably greatly impacted his play last season and affecting his confidence, just based on your discussion with him. So I guess I wanted to kind of understand just his general demeanor, body language that you had with him. Just how confident are you in Giddey having a bounce back year with a new team, a new environment, a big role on this team, obviously, with the front office having high expectations of him as sort of this point guard for the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I said this on my show. Like, I don't really know Josh that well. I've covered, like, been in a few media scrums with him since he's come over, and I hope to get to know him better. That's like a big part of my job, obviously. But for him to open up with someone who, like, he isn't super comfortable with, yet necessarily, just because like we haven't had a long enough time to really establish that kind of a relationship. And to open up in that way, I thought was really impressive. And, it was just interesting to hear his perspective. I mean, you mentioned the off court stuff, which he's asked reporters not to ask him about. He said he wasn't going to comment, and we've respected that. But, even from an on court perspective, like he was kind of relegated into a role of being a spot up shooter, which he's not really comfortable with. He was like in the dunker spot, which is not really his game. He wants to have the ball in his hands. He wants to make plays and help make guys better. And so I think last year was just really tough for him. I think he lost a lot of confidence in that role. And obviously he said like I was probably losing my confidence before, but when you get to a point where you're getting benched in the playoffs, that really is a low point. And so,
Right.
um, I think he got a chance to regain some of that, and playing with his Australian national team kind of reinvigorated him and helped him get back to a point where he was really excited about playing and felt more confident in his game. And I think he's looking to carry that over with now his new team. And I think the Bulls are going to put him in a position to lean into that and be successful in his role. So, yeah, I think he'll have, like we talked about, every opportunity to put his best foot forward. And I think just having the backing of the organization to be in a role that suits his skill set is important to him, which makes sense. And so I think we will see a better version of Giddey, but there's also, like I said, the questions about how he fits and his flaws and limitations in his game, and how you build around that moving forward. And I think that's kind of the bigger question here.
Yeah, I did want to shift now to Zach Levine a little bit. Obviously, we all know everything that happened last season with Zach, the drama around Zach and the Bulls having mutual interest in trading him, the Bulls being unable to find a trade for him throughout the season as well as this offseason. And here we are, 2 days from opening night, and Zach Levine is still on this team. So for me personally, I was going to say I've been very impressed with how Zach Levine has handled things going into the season. Though we kind of messaged back and forth a little bit of that offline. From his opening statement on media day, for how he's shown up in training camp in the preseason. He hasn't been kind of, moping, pouting for, still being on this team and having not been traded. And if I'm being honest, he actually looks more energized, engaged, and happy to be with this team. Now, who knows if that starts to change if the Bulls start struggling in the regular season and the Bulls still aren't able to find a trade for him. But what's been sort of your impression of Zach going into this season? And do you think there is a world now with DeMar being gone where the Bulls could potentially make this work in keeping Zach Levine? Or do you think ultimately he will still be traded at some point this season?
Yeah, I think ultimately he will be moved. I'm not sure it happens this season though. I think just
Mm,
during the season with these new rules, teams who are over the first apron, which most teams who would be considering trading for Zach, the playoff teams who need that extra scoring punch, most of those teams are over the first apron. And so
right.
that means they can't combine two salaries together in order to match Zach's. It means they can't take in more money than they send out. And so just finding a deal and the actual mechanics of it are a lot more difficult now than they ever have been. And I think that's a challenge that might be hard to overcome during the season. Maybe during the offseason, teams open up a little bit more space. There's more flexibility. Something can happen. Um, but I'm not getting my hopes up about the Bulls being able to find a deal that really benefits them. That can happen during the season. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think that it's going to be a challenge from a logistical standpoint. And in terms of like Zach and his demeanor, yeah, I mean, I told him like I really respected the way that he handled that on media day and just his approach coming in this season. It could have been kind of ugly and awkward, and he
Mhm.
hasn't let it get in the way. And I think he's even like stepped up to that challenge, wanted to face it head on. And he's thriving in this new system. I mean, they're getting the ball up and down. That suits him and his strengths. He's getting shots up, and he's not shy about that. So it's not like
Right.
he's running to the corner and waiting for, a catch and shoot three. He's involved in the offense, but he's also a part of an offense. And I think that's kind of what the Bulls needed from him all along. But I think it's also what other teams will need to see out of him if they're going to take the plunge and maybe make a trade eventually. So, yeah, I think ultimately, like the Bulls are already headed a different direction. At a certain point, they're going to have to make a move,
Right.
whether or not like it's a great one for them. But at the same time, like I think Zach is handling this situation as best he can, and I think he's kind of been the bigger person. Not that like the Bulls are, treating him unfairly or anything like that,
Yeah.
but I think both sides have just kind of come to the understanding that this is the situation, and they've got to make the best of it for both parties moving forward, because it's not a situation that's going to be resolved anytime soon.
Are you a bit more optimistic that the Bulls could get a better return than initially anticipated, given the fact, like you mentioned, he's been thriving in this new system thus far?
Yeah, I do. I don't think it's going to happen, like I said, even at this trade deadline. But
Mhm.
you look at next summer and it's like, okay, 2 years left on his deal. He's been healthy for a year now, hopefully, where he
Hopefully.
can prove that he, is capable of being out there. I think that was like the biggest thing is like, it's such a big contract. You don't want to trade for a guy that's not able to come back from a surgery he just had. But, he
Right.
was dealing with a broken foot for parts of last year. He gets a surgery. And he's back now. Like he looks himself. He looks really good. And
Yeah.
so I think that alone will re-inspire some teams to consider it. And I think when you have one party or many parties who are interested, that's when you can start to be a little bit more choosy about what you get in return. If nobody is interested, then you're just trying to like, dump him or get off him by any means necessary. And I think it was really wise for the Bulls to avoid doing that, where you're kind of entering sort of a rebuilding phase, whether you want to call it a hard rebuild or a retool, whatever. Like you are changing directions here and
Yeah.
you are being a little bit more okay with going towards the bottom and retaining that pick. You can't be giving up assets to get off of bad contracts. And I think that there's more potential for him to become, a neutral or slightly positive contract you know, as a year gets chopped off of this thing. Like a 2 year
Right.
contract at 49 million, whatever it is, that's not as daunting as 3 years for any
Yeah,
team.
for sure.
And so I think just time alone will make this a little bit better. And then you factor in him coming back and playing well and being healthy. I think all those things play into Zach's and the Bulls' favor.
How about for Vooch? Obviously he doesn't really fit the Bulls timeline anymore with this new youth movement. Do you see any scenario where he could potentially be traded at some point this season? Or do you think the Bulls are kind of in a position where they're more or less stuck with him until the end of the contract?
Yeah, I think Vooch is a little bit more of an easy move as a contract just because he's like at 20 right now as opposed to 43,
Right.
which is
Right.
where Zach is. There's a couple teams out there that could use some help at center, but he's still a big contract and that is hard to move. So I think it's more possible that somebody decides that they want to do that. He's obviously got one fewer year left on his deal.
Mhm.
But if a deal was out there already, I think it probably would be taken. Just like I said, nothing against Vooch, like at all. But I think it speaks to the direction that the team is heading and wanting to get younger. And he obviously just isn't a part of the long term vision. I mean, he's in his mid 30s already. So,
Right.
yeah, I don't, and I think like in terms of his style of play and fitting in with this, like he, I think does kind of fit into this style of play a little bit better. I
Yeah.
mean, he's not going to be
Agreed.
on the block calling for post ups and being forced to create a ton of offense and having double teams come at him and making plays. Like there's gonna be times where that happens. There's also gonna be times where he's just trailing the play. Uh, Nothing happens in transition. You swing it back to him and he's got an open three, or he's able to attack a closeout. Or maybe it does get bogged down a little bit and then you kind of go to him in his spots. But he's been really efficient and not taking up a lot of space or shots in this
Yeah.
preseason. I think he's playing really well. And so again, that's an opportunity to help boost his trade value. But for him, I think he probably wants to be in a winning situation. And so, like I said, with the same thing with Zach, it's like nothing against these guys, but like the reality is the direction has changed. That probably
Yeah.
means it's time to move on. But you can't just dump your guys and attach picks to do so because you want to change direction. And
Yeah.
so I think they need to bide their time a little bit with that.
I mentioned Zach looking more energized and engaged, even with Vucevic. I mean, obviously he's, a more stoic player just in general, right? Doesn't show a ton of emotion, but I just feel like I go back to last season, in the beginning of last season, where they started off 5-14 or whatever it was, right? And it just looked like, especially for Zach and Vooch, they just looked checked out. Like, just did not want to be there. Did not enjoy playing together as a team. I don't know. I mean, again, I know it's preseason, but just based on how everything's been looking, they seem to be enjoying how this new team is fitting together, which has been great to see. I think the biggest question going now into this season that I wanted to get your thoughts on, I think a lot of it's on a lot of Bulls fans' mind is, you know, are the Bulls going to be able to keep their pick for this upcoming draft? Which of course is owed to the Spurs and the DeMar sign and trade if it falls outside of the top 10. There are some that say the Bulls, as of right now, have too much talent to really put them in a position to keep that pick. Some have said lose as many games as possible, keep the pick at all costs because of how stacked this upcoming draft class is. Others have said, It's not worth creating a losing mentality and culture, a small or losing culture for a small chance at landing someone like Cooper Flag or Ace Bailey. If the guys play well together, they're having fun, let them do their thing. Lose the pick, some say so be it. What is your stance on this?
Yeah, I think the pick is the most important thing in the season,
Mm,
by far. Like you can say, oh, they're going to give it up at some point during this. It's top 10 protected this year, then top 8
right.
in next season, and top 8 the season after that. They are probably going to give it up at some point. But if you wait a year to do that, now you've just like wasted an opportunity, a full season where you have a chance at getting a franchise player. And the
Right.
reason I say it's so important is because, look, I'm sure you as a fan, you want to win a championship, right? Like maybe it's not like championship or bust, but you want to be competing. You want to be at a high
Yeah.
level. Arturas Karnisovas has said the same thing. He wants to, bring a championship to Chicago. He wants to get to a point where he's adding 10 wins from last year, which was obviously 39. So, getting to a 50-win season, that's going to take a franchise player. That's like the
Yeah.
reality of the situation. If you want to be competing at a high level, history says you need a top 10 player, if not multiple. And so the way to do that is trade, draft, free agency. They can't
Mhm.
really make a trade right now because one, they're already down picks. They're in a down situation where the value of their outgoing pick would be really great. And the risk of that is too much. You don't really have the contracts you can move in order to bring in a star player. And there aren't many star players available on the trade market right now. They
Right.
also are over the cap. And so you
Mhm.
can't really go out and sign a max player in free agency unless you are able to wipe off a ton of, long-term money on your books, Zach and Vooch and Lonzo being the big ones. That's going to be really difficult, as we know. Like there's not a lot of suitors out there. And if and when they do find a deal, it's not like they're just going to be dumping them completely into space. They're going to have to take back some money in a deal like that anyway. So that leaves you with the draft, and you have an opportunity here. Like they are worse than last year in terms of they have much less talent on their team,
Mhm.
from a high end, standpoint. They lost DeMar DeRozan, they lost Alex Caruso. It's going to be hard to get to a point where you're competing at a high level without a star player like that. And so the way to do it is the draft. I understand the odds are flattened. It's a lot harder. But to me, it's like unless you have that franchise changing player, like you're not really going anywhere. And so you have to identify and get that guy. The way to do that is the draft. There is a guy at the top of this draft who could be that franchise changing star in Cooper Flag. There's a couple of
Mhm.
other guys that I think could be really great NBA players as well. And so I think like you're in a 2-year rebuild where you have to prioritize keeping your pick, and not only keeping it, but getting it to the top of the draft, because ultimately that's where the stars are. And so unless you are getting super lucky with the seventh, eighth, ninth pick, like it's just going to be hard to find the franchise cornerstone. And
Right.
if they do find that, they've got some nice pieces to put around them. But to me, like nothing starts until you find that guy. And that has to be the priority here.
And well, I guess the question though, Will, is are they going to be bad enough to be able to do that? Because I look across, especially the Eastern Conference, right? The Bulls are better, at least on paper, and especially after what we've seen in the preseason, than a lot of other teams, right? The Nets, Pistons, Wizards, Blazers in the Western Conference. Like those teams are going to be tanking. They're going to be losing a lot of games this year. And so I think that's sort of the big question is, are the Bulls going to be bad enough, not even just to keep their top 10 pick, but to actually get into, say a top five, top four, what have you, to actually land a franchise changing level player? Because I think even as they currently stand, one, they either lose the pick if they're actually good enough to do that, or like you said, it's going to be in that 7 to 9 range, which is great if they're still able to keep the pick. But you said it's more like at that range, you kind of just hope that you get lucky with a really good player at that level. I don't know. What do you think? Like, do you think that they are a team as currently constructed bad enough to be able to actually have a shot at that?
Yeah, I mean, they clearly have more talent than some of these real bottom feeders. And I don't think they're trying to necessarily be the worst team in the league. Like you
Right.
think about it from the Wizards perspective, like they stripped it all down and then they're hoping to find the franchise player and then start building. The Bulls are
Right.
going by a different approach. They are like, okay, we've got our foundation and now we just need the franchise changing player. So maybe
Right.
that gives you, a 7.5% chance at the top pick instead of a 14% chance. But if you do win, now that foundation is there and you can actually hit the ground running, compared to a team like the Wizards, where like they would still be, years away from being able to accumulate enough talent to really move forward. And so I understand why the Bulls would take this approach. To me, like getting that top pick is such a massive priority that I would be prioritizing that over having the foundation. And I think that does put you at risk of not being low enough in the lottery odds to be able to get that guy. The odds are flattened out, so there's always going to be a chance that they can move up. Obviously, the Hawks moved from 10 to 1 this past
Right.
season, but at the same time that happened, what people forget to mention is that the Pistons moved from the worst record to the fifth record
Mhm.
for the third straight year, and the Hornets moved from 3 to 6. And that cost them a chance at a franchise-changing player. So moving back in the lottery is just as much a risk as moving up. And so
Mhm.
I think you need to like position yourself as best as possible to keep that. That would mean being the sixth worst team in the league to guarantee keeping your pick, to give yourself the best chance to move up. So I don't think that they're going to be the worst team in the league. I don't think they're going to be bottom 3 or 4 or 5. But I think at a certain point, like they're going to either have to, and we're going to learn about a lot about this front office. Are they going to pull the plug and lean into that at the end of the season? Are they going to, sell off and trade some of their veteran pieces, or are they going to make another push for the play-in and hope that they get lucky moving from 8, 9, 10 to 1 instead of 4, 5, 6? And so I think they are not currently constructed to be the worst team in the league, and I think that is concerning. Like the risk there, I think, is greater than you want it to be, given what's at stake here at the top of the draft.
So kind of with that then, well, I'll get you out of here on this one. Predictions. How do you see the Bulls finishing the season? Number of wins, seeding in the East. Are they going to be able to get that top 10 pick? What do you think?
Yeah, so I made my original prediction prior to preseason.
Mhm.
So I'm gonna stick with it, even though I think clearly watching this team in preseason, like they are a little bit better than I thought they were going to be.
Yeah.
So I could see them getting into like low 30s, low to mid 30s in wins, like 32, 34. But my initial pick was 27, so I'll stick with that. I think they'll probably finish 11th or 12th in the East, and give themselves a good enough chance to keep their pick in the lottery. But like you're talking about, I mean, I don't think they're going to be one of the bottom couple teams, and so it will be a little bit of a nail biter towards this end of the season, just kind of counting the wins and losses against some of those other teams. But I'll go with 27 and 55, which was my pick earlier on in the summer, and I think they'll finish, let's call it 12th in the East.
Yeah. I've got I'm more leaning towards where you're after the preseason where you're kind of
Yeah,
landing in that sort of low 30s, mid 30s range just based on what I've seen thus far. And I wouldn't be shocked if the Bulls
someone's
find
got to get 10th.
Yes, I wouldn't be shocked if the Bulls find themselves in the play-in, yet again, which, is not gonna be good in terms of being able to keep that pick, but that's kind of where we are at this point. Will, as always, my man, really appreciate you making the time, coming on, heading over
Anytime.
before you head over to the Advocate Center for the Bulls practice today. Keep up the great work and, covering this team. We'll be following along the whole way, and, best of luck in this upcoming season.
Thanks, man. We'll gotta get you back on our show too. It's always great talking with you. And yeah, we'll see how the season goes. Should be interesting.
For sure, man. Alright, and thanks for tuning in, guys. I will see you in the next one.